Nobody at the ball remembered the girl in the torn purple dress, but everyone remembered the cold whisper that slid through the candles when midnight came. If anyone had been watching closely, they would have seen that the only eyes truly awake in that glittering hall were not human at all. Music floated through the high stone arches, sweet and bright, while Liana stood in the shadow of a pillar, fingers twisted in the fabric of her skirt. Her cousin had insisted she come, said this winter ball would change her life, but an hour had passed and no one had even asked her name. Laughter spun around her like a cruel wind, all silk and perfume and jeweled masks. When people brushed past, they didn't say sorry. Most didn't even seem to see her. She tried to smile anyway because that was what kind people did. When a group of girls in glittering gowns stepped near, Liana shrank back to give them space. One of them glanced at her, eyes sliding over the frayed hem of her dress, the small patch carefully sewn at the elbow. There was a tiny tightening of her lips, not quite a smile, not quite a sneer, more like the silent decision to look away. Liana's heart sank, but she lifted her chin. She told herself she didn't come here to be chosen. She came because, for once, she wanted to stand where the light was. High above, in the darkness between the chandeliers and the painted ceiling, another figure watched her. The crowd did not know his name. They called him the patron, the Lord of Old Stone, the one who keeps the valley safe at night. Only the bravest whispered the truth. He was the king beneath the mountain, the last of the old ones, the vampire king who ruled the shadows so gently that most forgot he was there at all. His real name had not been spoken aloud in 100 years. He leaned on the balcony rail, pale hands resting on worn stone, a glass of untouched red wine glowing like a drop of captured sunset beside him. The music did not interest him. The swirling dancers, the politicians, the flattery and schemes. He could hear every false note in every laugh, every small cruelty buried in pleasant words. For centuries he had watched parties just like this, faces changing, mistakes repeating. The living rushed in circles, desperate to be seen, desperate to belong, and then they faded, one by one. He had grown used to it, or so he told himself. Yet tonight, something tugged at him. His sharp gaze moved over the crowd, not hunting, merely observing, until it stopped on the girl in the shadows. She did not know how her eyes softened when someone else was embarrassed. She did not see how she stepped aside so others wouldn't feel crowded. She clutched a chipped glass of punch like it was a shield, pretending to be interested in the melted ice. Her dress was the wrong shade of purple for the fashion of the night, but the color held a quiet dignity, like fading velvet on an old throne. He watched as a young man, breathless and handsome, rushed toward her. For a heartbeat, Liana's shoulders straightened. Someone had finally seen her, but the man stumbled to a stop just behind her, calling another girl's name. His hand brushed Liana's arm as he passed. He did not even notice. The vampire king heard the tiny change in Liana's breathing. A soft hitch quickly smothered. She didn't cry. She did something that struck him harder, something he had seen in lonely villagers and weary widows, but rarely in the very young. She folded the hurt into herself, quietly, as if she were used to it, as if this kind of evening, standing alone while the world celebrated around her, was nothing new. He felt an old ache stir in his chest, when he thought he had buried under centuries of discipline. In his first life, before the bite, before the crown of shadows, he had known that same invisible weight. Being the one no one chose, the one everyone turned to only when they needed a favor, never when they needed a friend. It was a memory he had locked away, but the sight of this human girl pulled it back into the light. Down below, the orchestra shifted to a faster song. Lanterns flared. Servants carried silver trays through the crowd. Liana stepped a little deeper into the corner, back pressed to cold stone, trying to make room for others to pass. Her feet ached in borrowed shoes. Her stomach twisted with a quiet hunger, but she kept her hands folded. She didn't want to look greedy at the buffet table. Her cousin, who had promised to stay by her side, was already laughing in the center of the floor, spinning under the chandeliers in the arms of a shining stranger. Liana told herself a small, trembling lie. I'm happy for her. That's enough. On the balcony, the vampire king closed his eyes and listened to the steady throb of countless human hearts below. Each beat was a bright, short-lived flame. He had spent so long keeping his distance, helping from far away, turning storms aside, quieting the wolves outside the village, making sure the wells never ran dry, always unseen, always unnamed. It felt safer that way. Every time he let a mortal become more than a passing face, the pain of their leaving cut deeper than any blade. But the girl's silence, her stubborn politeness in the face of being ignored, slid past his defenses like a whisper of winter wind. He set down the glass of wine. The liquid trembled as he moved. Candlelight caught on the silver ring at his finger, on the dark embroidery of his coat, rich and regal yet marked by centuries of careful repair. He had more power than anyone in that hall, more knowledge, more years. Yet in this moment he felt strangely unsure, like a boy again, hovering at the edge of a room where he did not quite belong. Just watch, he told himself. Nothing more, you promised. He had made a vow long ago, no more entanglements, no more stepping directly into human lives. To protect them, yes. To guide from the shadows if needed. But not to reach out, not to care this personally. That path always ended in grief. Below, Liana tried once more. A group near her was discussing the fireworks planned for midnight, and she gathered every fragile piece of courage she had left to speak. My uncle used to make fireworks, she said softly, offering a shy, hopeful smile. He said the sparks are like... Oh, one of the women interrupted, glancing at Liana's dress and then quickly away. We're actually in the middle of something. Excuse me. Their circle closed again, shutting her out as neatly as if someone had closed a door in her face. The unfinished sentence fell from Liana's lips and broke silently at her feet. The vampire king's hand tightened on the railing. The old stone groaned softly under his grip. This wasn't cruelty in its loudest form. No one had insulted her. No one had laughed. But he knew that quiet dismissal could wound deeper than open mockery. It taught a person to believe their voice did not matter. Her voice does matter, something inside him protested. He watched as Liana's shoulders sagged. For a heartbeat, the candlelight around her seemed dimmer. Then, slowly, she straightened. She smoothed the wrinkles from her skirt, steadied her breathing, and turned her face toward the music again. There was resignation there, yes, but also a stubborn, fragile sort of dignity. She was not going to run away in tears. She was going to stay, even if no one cared that she had. You are brave, he murmured under his breath, surprised by the warmth in his own voice. For the first time in decades, direct interference felt not only tempting, but necessary. Not because he pitied her, but because he recognized something fierce and beautiful fighting to survive inside that quiet heart. The world might not see it, but he did. And once he saw, he could not easily turn away. The orchestra began a slow, elegant waltz. Couples drifted together, the dance floor blooming with silks and smiles. A servant paused near Liana with a tray of sugared fruit, hesitated as if unsure whether to offer it to the girl pressed against the wall, then slipped away in favor of someone more brightly dressed. Liana watched them go. For a moment, her hand lifted, then dropped again. When she thought no one was looking, she whispered to herself, voice barely audible even to his sharp ears. Maybe I should have stayed home. The shadows felt kinder there. Those quiet words cut through him like frost. Enough, he decided. He stepped back from the balcony rail. As he moved, the shadows near him thickened, flowing like dark water, wrapping him in their familiar cool embrace. The hall below did not notice the breeze that sighed through the candles, making their flames bow for a second, as if in greeting. Only Liana felt it, a soft, inexplicable shiver down her spine, like someone had just spoken her name without sound. In that instant, he knew the risk. If he walked into that hall, fully himself, old promises would be broken. Lines he had drawn to protect his own heart would blur. The girl's life, already delicate, might become tangled with secrets and dangers she could not yet imagine. But if he stayed away, she would leave tonight believing, once again, that she was forgettable, unchosen, invisible. He could endure another century of loneliness. He was not sure she could endure another night of that kind of silence. With a quiet breath that tasted of stone and starlight, the vampire king made his choice. He stepped off the balcony, letting the shadows carry him downward like a silent tide. The candles along the walls flickered as he passed. Conversations dipped and rose, unaware that the oldest power in the valley was gliding through the air, drawing closer to the girl no one saw. And as Liana stared at the floor, swallowing the last of her courage, a voice unlike any she had ever heard, low, calm, and strangely gentle, spoke from just behind her shoulder. "Forgive me," the stranger said, his tone warm with a quiet respect no one else had offered her all night. "May I stand with you, where the light somehow looks brightest?" Liana froze, heart hammering, every instinct telling her that something more than human had just stepped into the circle of her loneliness. She turned slowly to see who had finally noticed her, without knowing that this single choice, to meet his eyes, would change the fate of her life and the fate of the vampire king forever. By the time Liana turned around, her heart was beating so loudly she could barely hear the music. She expected another careless boy with a smug smile, or perhaps an older gentleman looking for a polite, forgettable dance. Instead, she found herself staring into a face that made the entire ballroom blur at the edges. He was dressed in deep violet, richer than any color she had ever seen, the fabric catching the candlelight like the night sky just before dawn. His hair, long and pale as winter moonlight, fell over his shoulders in loose waves. His features were sharp but not cruel, carved with ancient patience rather than pride. What struck her most, though, were his eyes gray, but layered with shadows, as if they had seen so much that they had simply stopped reflecting light back in the usual way. Yet right now, those unusual eyes were incredibly gentle, focused entirely on her, as if she were the only person in the room. For a moment, Liana forgot to breathe. "You're not standing in the best place," he said softly, a hint of humor in his voice. "The drafts from the door are terrible here. May I?" He gestured to the empty space beside her, asking permission instead of assuming it. No one ever asked to share her corner. "Why, yes," she managed, then winced at the tiny stutter. "I mean, of course." He stepped closer, but not too close, just enough that she could feel his presence as a steady, cool calm at her side. The crowd moved around them, laughter and silk swirling like waves crashing against a stone cliff, but here in this small pocket of space, everything felt strangely still. For several seconds, he said nothing. Liana waited for the usual questions. "Whose daughter are you?" Or "Why aren't you dancing?" Instead, he simply stood with her, looking out over the hall as if they were sharing the same view from a high balcony. "I saw you," he said quietly after a moment. "The way you stepped aside to let that girl pass so she wouldn't bump into the tray. Most people wouldn't have noticed." Liana blinked. Heat rushed to her cheeks. That tiny act of politeness had been automatic, something she did all the time without thinking. No one had ever mentioned it before. "Oh," she said, unsure how to respond. "It was nothing." "Kindness," he replied, "is never nothing." The way he said the word kindness made it sound like a rare and precious metal. Liana's throat tightened unexpectedly. She studied his profile, trying to place him. He didn't wear the crest of any local house. His clothes seemed older than the fashions around them, yet perfectly preserved. Even his ring, silver with a dark stone, looked like it belonged to a different century. "Have we met before?" she asked carefully. "You feel familiar somehow." The corner of his mouth lifted in a faint smile, tinged with something that almost looked like sorrow. "In a way," he said. "I've spent a long time watching over this place." "From where?" she said, then flushed. Sorry, that sounded rude. Everyone here seems to know each other, and she trailed off, clenching her hands so her voice wouldn't shake. I don't exactly belong. He turned to her fully at that, as if the word belong was more important than anything else in the room. Why do you think that? He asked, his tone quiet but intent. It didn't feel like prying. It felt like he was giving her space to speak if she wanted to. Liana hesitated. Normally she would have smiled, shrugged, changed the subject. Tonight, exhaustion and hurt had worn down her defenses. This stranger's unexpected kindness, the way he had simply stood beside her without asking her to be different, made the truth slip out before she could stop it. Because no one looks at me, she admitted, voice low. Not really, they look through me. When I speak, I interrupt. When I stand anywhere, I'm in the way. When people say everyone, they never mean me. It's like I'm extra, like the world already has enough of everything and I'm just another piece it doesn't really need. The words, once started, would not stop. She stared down at her hands, afraid to see pity on his face. I thought maybe tonight would be different, she went on, almost whispering. New dress, even if it's old for someone else, new place, new people. But it's the same story. I smile, I give way, I listen. And somehow I still end up here in the corner holding a drink that's turned to water. Silence rested between them for a long, fragile moment. The music swelled, a violin note climbing high and aching. Liana braced herself, ready for the usual response. The gentle, distant, I'm sure it's not that bad, or the empty compliment meant to patch over embarrassment. Instead, the man beside her spoke with a steadiness that made her chest ache. Then the world has been dishonest with you, he said. Because it does need you. It needs people who notice when others are left out, people who step aside without being asked, people who feel invisible and still choose to be kind. Do you know how rare that is? Liana looked up, startled. Their eyes met, and something inside her, some old, curled-up part that had stopped hoping anyone would ever truly see her, flinched, then slowly uncurled, like a small animal peeking out of its hiding place. Maybe I'm just used to it, she said, though the words felt weaker now. When you're ordinary, you learn to disappear. It makes it easier for everyone else. His expression changed, almost imperceptibly. There was pain there now, but it wasn't for himself. It was for her. I know what it is to disappear for the sake of others, he murmured. To stand in the shadows so they can dance under the lights. He paused, eyes searching her face. But I also know that being unseen does not mean you are unworthy. Something in his voice made her curious. What about you? She asked, surprising herself. You talk like someone who's watched a lot of parties from far away. His gaze flicked toward the chandeliers, the balconies, the dark windows that looked out over the sleeping valley. I have, he said, more than I can easily count. How long have you lived here? She pressed, the question escaping before she could soften it. A faint, wry smile touched his lips. Longer than anyone here remembers. He hesitated, choosing his words carefully. An old guardian, you might say. I keep to the edges. People celebrate. They forget the quiet work that keeps the night gentle. Liana frowned slightly. That sounded like a story, not an answer. Yet there was a gravity in his tone that made it hard to dismiss. You make it sound lonely, she said. It is, he replied simply. But some burdens are easier to bear from the shadows. People are less afraid when they don't see what protects them. There was a sadness in that statement that reached into her, echoing her own feelings in an unexpected way. She thought of all the times she had carried other people's problems, listening to their worries, cheering them on, only to stand alone when she needed a hand. She thought of how easy it was for everyone to overlook the person steadying the ladder or holding the door. I'm sorry, she said softly, meaning it more than she expected to. That sounds heavy. His eyes warmed at her sincerity, like a candle flame sheltered from the wind. You're the first person to say that, he admitted. Most would be relieved not to know. Liana wasn't sure why, but she believed him. A new song began, slower, filled with long, lingering notes that felt like questions hanging in the air. Couples drifted past them. Liana could feel the curious glances now, because whoever this man was, he carried an unspoken authority that made people step aside without realizing why. They moved around him the way water moves around a solid rock in a river. "People are staring at you," she murmured, half embarrassed on his behalf. "Let them," he replied calmly. "I'm not here for them." The simple statement dropped into her heart like a stone into deep water, sending ripples through every old belief she held about her own worth. No one had ever said anything like that to her. Not in that tone, not with that quiet certainty. "Then why are you here?" she whispered. He looked at her, as if the answer were obvious. "Because you looked like you were about to disappear," he said, "and I do not like to see good things fade." Liana swallowed hard. Her eyes stung, but she refused to cry. Not here. Not now. Still, a single tear escaped before she could stop it, trailing down her cheek like a silver thread in the candlelight. She flinched, reaching up to wipe it away, embarrassed. Before she could, he moved, not with sudden urgency, but with a slow, deliberate care, as though any quick motion might frighten her. His fingertip brushed just beneath her eye, catching the tear before it fell. To her surprise, his touch was cool, almost soothing, like the first touch of evening air after a long summer day. "Don't be ashamed," he said softly. "Tears mean your heart is still brave enough to feel." She hadn't realized how badly she needed to hear that until the words settled inside her. Her breath shook once, then steadied. "Who are you?" she asked, her voice almost a whisper. But this time the question was not polite curiosity. It was something deeper, a thread thrown across a chasm, asking if it was safe to pull. The music swelled again. Around them, laughter rose and fell, distant and unimportant. The world felt narrowed to the space between his eyes and hers, to the soft press of his hand as it came to rest gently, carefully on her shoulder, as though asking one more silent question. "Do you trust me enough to stay?" The truth pressed at the back of his throat. He could have lied. He had grown skilled at half-truths and careful omissions over the years. But standing here, with this fragile, quietly courageous girl who had just handed him pieces of her fear without asking for anything in return, he found that the usual masks felt wrong. "My name would not mean much to you," he said at last, voice low, "but the stories people tell about me might." He held her gaze, giving her every chance to look away. "They call me the king beneath the mountain, the lord of old stone, the one who walks when others sleep." Her heartbeat stuttered, quickened. The titles were familiar. Whispers from childhood, tales told around winter fires. Her uncle's voice surfaced in her memory. "When you walk home at night, say thank you to the one who keeps the dark from biting too deep." Her lips parted. "You're saying," her throat constricted around the words, "you're not just a man," he finished gently. "No, not anymore." The candles nearest them flickered, dipping low as if bowing to something unseen. For a moment, his eyes caught the light in a strange way, reflecting it back with a faint, inhuman gleam, a shadow of silver on storm gray. Liana's breath locked in her chest. "You're—" the word refused to form, trapped between fear and an inexplicable sense of safety. Every story she'd heard painted his kind as monsters or saviors, never something in between. Yet here he was, standing beside her like a quiet defender, speaking of kindness and loneliness and invisible burdens. A part of her wanted to step back, to put distance between herself and the impossible truth. Another part, just as strong, remembered how he had seen her when no one else had, how he had spoken to her as if her feelings mattered, as if her existence was not a burden but a gift. He watched her carefully, not moving closer, not reaching out. There was no pressure in his silence, only waiting, only respect. "You're afraid," he said softly, not accusing, simply observing. "I don't know what I am," she whispered. "Afraid, curious, confused. You're everything they say we should fear. And yet," she swallowed, eyes burning, "you're the first person who has made me feel like I'm not invisible." He closed his eyes for a moment, as if those words hit him harder than any weapon. "I will not harm you," he said, and somehow the promise felt heavier than any royal oath. "If you wish, I will walk away, and no one will trouble you tonight." His hand lifted from her shoulder, leaving a cool emptiness behind. "Your will matters more than any story told about me." She stared at him, at the man who was not entirely a man, at the ancient power wrapped in a coat of violet and quiet humility. Around them, the music spun on as if nothing remarkable was happening, as if the entire course of her life was not balanced on the edge of this one choice. "Wait," she said before she could lose her courage. "If I ask you to stay, will you?" The question trembled on the air, fragile and fierce at once. 1,000 years of solitude, of watching from the dark, pressed against the back of his mind. Old vows, old fears, the certainty that if he stepped fully into her life, he would change it forever, and not always in ways she might welcome. Yet there she was, asking him not to leave. He opened his eyes. The storm in them had quieted, replaced by something deep and resolute. "Yes," he answered. "If you ask me to stay, I will." Liana drew in a shaking breath. She could feel the weight of the entire hall behind her, the glittering, shallow world that had never once paused for her pain. Then she looked at him, at the ancient loneliness in his gaze and the fragile hope he was trying so hard to hide. "I don't want to be invisible anymore," she said, voice barely louder than a sigh. "Not to myself, not to," she hesitated, then finished, "not to you." Slowly, as if each movement might shatter something delicate, she extended her hand toward him. He stared at it, stunned, not by the gesture itself, but by the trust it represented. For a heartbeat, centuries of caution held him still. Then, with a care that made the air around them hold its breath, the vampire king reached out and took her hand in his. His skin was cool, yes, but steady, solid, real. In that moment, a subtle shift rippled through the hall. Conversations faltered. A few people turned, frowning faintly, as if sensing a change they couldn't name. The candles above them flared just a little brighter, casting a circle of light around the girl no one had noticed an hour before. "You have just done something very brave," he said quietly. "So have you," she replied, surprising herself with the certainty in her tone. Their fingers remained entwined, a fragile bridge between two worlds that were never meant to meet. And somewhere, far away in the dark edges of the valley, something old and dangerous stirred, as if it had felt the moment the vampire king broke his long-held distance and chose one human girl, one overlooked, ordinary girl, as the center of his attention. Neither of them knew it yet, but that choice had just awakened an enemy that had been waiting for him to care about someone again. Unaware of the shadow rising beyond the ballroom walls, Liana held his gaze, her heart finally beginning to believe that maybe, just maybe, she was not meant to fade. She parted her lips to ask the next trembling question, only for the music to crash to an abrupt stop and the great doors of the hall to fly open, wind slamming through the candles and snuffing half of them out at once. Gasps rang through the room as darkness rushed in. Still holding her hand, the vampire king lifted his head sharply, his eyes turning from gentle gray to something far older and far more dangerous. "Stay close to me," he whispered. For the first time that night, Liana realized that being seen by him might be the safest and the most terrifying thing that had ever happened to her. The candles flickered violently as the doors slammed against the walls. A blast of cold air tore through the hall, scattering music sheets and chilling the sweat on dancers' necks. For one frozen heartbeat, no one moved. Then the whispering began. From the doorway, a thin gray mist rolled across the floor like low, hungry fog. It snaked between gowns and polished boots, ignoring screams and startled shouts, heading straight toward the center of the hall. Straight toward Liana. Her hand clamped tighter around the Vampire King-S. Instinct screamed at her to run, but his grip was steady, anchoring her in place. His eyes, moments ago soft and human, were now bright and sharp as shattered starlight. "This is my fault," he murmured, more to himself than to her. "It has been waiting for me to care." "What is it?" Liana whispered. He stepped slightly in front of her, his body a calm, solid barrier. "An old hunger," he said. "Something that feeds on fear and neglect. I have kept it away from this valley for centuries. It must have felt my attention turn." He glanced back at her. "To you." A figure began to take shape in the foggy tall, shifting, made of tattered shadow and cold. It had no clear face, only a sense of emptiness, like a hollow space wrapped in darkness. When it spoke, its voice was every cruel whisper Liana had ever heard in her life, all layered together. "No one sees you," it hissed, its words sliding across the marble like oil. "You are nothing, extra, unwanted, invisible." The crowd recoiled. Some covered their ears. Others stared, horrified, at the way the shadow's voice seemed aimed at Liana alone. She flinched. Those words were too familiar, too sharp. They sliced along old scars she had tried to ignore. The Vampire King's hand squeezed hers. "Listen to me," he said, low and urgent. "That creature is made of every lie lonely hearts tell themselves in the dark. It has no power unless you believe it. Do you understand?" Liana swallowed, her throat tight. "I've believed those words my whole life." "And yet you are still here," he countered. "Still kind, still brave enough to care. That is strength, Liana, not weakness." The shadow laughed, a hollow echoing sound. "She is nothing," it taunted. "You protect her because you are lonely, king of nothing. When she is gone, you will return to the dark. You always do." He straightened slowly, the centuries settling around him like a cloak. For the first time, the entire hall saw him as he truly was, not just a strange noble, but the ancient ruler of the night. Fear shivered through the crowd, but beneath it, something else began to stir, respect and a dawning gratitude. "You are wrong," he said to the shadow, his voice no longer soft but ringing, clear and unwavering. "I protected them before I knew her. I will protect them long after. But tonight—" He stepped sideways so Liana stood clearly beside him, their hands still joined. "Tonight I choose not to stand alone." The fog recoiled, hissing. "You cannot fight what she believes," it spat. "I am her doubt, her silence, her shame. I have grown strong in her." Liana trembled. The words felt too true, too close. Years of being overlooked pressed down on her, memories crowding in, empty seats beside her, forgotten invitations, conversations drifting past without her. "I'm scared," she whispered. "I know," he replied. "Courage is not the absence of fear. It is choosing something greater than fear." He turned to her, and his eyes, despite their inhuman light, were full of an aching tenderness. "Liana, for once in your life, believe the one person who sees you clearly. Believe me instead of it." "How?" her voice broke. He lifted their joined hands, placing them against his own chest. Beneath her fingers, his heart beat slowly, too slowly for a human, but it beat all the same. "Look," he said quietly, "an immortal heart. I have walked through plagues and wars, watched empires rise and fall. I have faced creatures far older than this shadow. Nothing has shaken me as deeply as hearing you say you thought you didn't matter." His voice roughened. "You changed me tonight. You made me break my own rules. Do you truly believe someone extra could do that?" Something inside her cracked, not from pain, but from the strain of being held too small for too long. Warmth spread through her chest, fragile but real. "No," she whispered. "I suppose they couldn't." The shadow hissed again, shrinking slightly, its edges trembling. "Say it louder," he urged gently. "For yourself, not for me." Liana swallowed hard. The hall had gone silent, hundreds of eyes fixed on her, but for once that did not crush her. It lifted her. "I am not extra," she said, her voice unsteady but growing. "I am not nothing. I am kind. I notice when others are hurt. I stay even when I feel alone. That matters." With every word, the shadow shuddered, thinning like smoke in wind. "I matter," she finished, the last two words landing like a small, fierce hammer blow. Light flared where she stood, gentle, golden, as if the truth inside her had finally found a way out. It wasn't magic in the usual sense. It was something simpler and stronger, a heart refusing to agree with its own destruction. The fog screamed, a thin sound of breaking glass. It tried to surge forward, but the vampire king stepped between it and Liana fully now, drawing shadows to him like armor. "You have fed on their neglect for too long," he said, his voice deep with command. "On every child who believed they were forgettable. Tonight you starve." With his free hand, he reached into the darkness itself. The room seemed to hold its breath as the shadows of pillars, of curtains, of every hidden corner rushed toward his palm, spinning into a dense, whirling orb of night. But within it, there sparkled small points of light, tiny, stubborn glimmers, like stars that refused to go out. "These," he said, his gaze never leaving the creature, "are every act of unseen courage, every quiet kindness done without witnesses. You thought you alone ruled the forgotten places. You were wrong. They belong to those who love without applause." He thrust the orb into the heart of the fog. There was no explosion, no violent blast. Instead, there was a soft, almost gentle sound, like a deep sigh being released after too many years. The fog absorbed the light, and then unraveled from within, threads of gray dissolving into nothing, as if the lies that held it together had lost their power. In moments, it was gone. The candles steadied. Warmth slid back into the hall. Someone sobbed quietly with relief. Others dropped to their knees, whispering thanks they couldn't fully understand. Liana stood very still, her hand still pressed to the vampire king's chest. His shoulders loosened as the last of the darkness faded. Slowly, he turned to her. "Are you harmed?" he asked. She shook her head, overwhelmed. "No, I didn't know I could do that." "You believed the truth," he said simply. "That is more powerful than you think." Around them, people were staring, not just at him now, but at her. There was no mockery in their faces, no dismissal. Only awe, curiosity, and something that looked very much like respect. It felt strange to be seen this much, too bright, too new. She glanced up at him, panic flickering. "They're all looking at me." "Then let them see you as you truly are," he replied softly. "Not because I stand beside you, but because you stood beside yourself." Tears threatened again, but this time they were warm and clean, not heavy with shame. "What happens now?" she asked. He hesitated. His gaze moved over the crowd, the walls, the windows showing a hint of night beyond, the kingdom he had guarded alone for so long. "Now," he said slowly, "they will remember that someone watches over them, and I—" He turned back to her, a question hidden beneath his formal tone. "I must decide whether to return to the shadows or to risk walking beside someone who can be hurt by the life I lead." Her heart twisted. She thought of his centuries of solitude, the way his eyes had softened when she called him lonely. She thought of the way he'd stood in front of her without hesitation when danger came. "Is it really safer," she asked quietly, "to feel nothing?" The question seemed to hit him harder than the shadow's attack. "No," he admitted after a moment. "It is only quieter." She took a breath, hands trembling. I don't know what it means to be seen by someone like you. I don't know what you are really or how long you stay in one place, but I know how it feels to live like I'm invisible. She lifted her chin. I don't want that life anymore. Not for me, not for you. The vulnerability in her words was a kind of courage he had rarely seen. We are not equals, he warned gently. My years, my duties. Your years don't scare me, she interrupted softly. Only the thought of going back to being a ghost in my own story does. Silence stretched between them, soft but intense. Finally, the vampire king did something no story had ever described him doing. He looked uncertain, almost shy. If I stay, he said, voice low so only she could hear, I cannot promise you simplicity. There will be nights of danger, people who do not understand, choices that hurt. Liana thought of the shadow's words, of her old belief that she was extra, unnecessary. She realized that whether or not he stayed, her life had already changed. She had already stood up to the darkest part of herself. She had already stepped out of the corner. I don't need simple, she answered, surprising herself with the steadiness in her voice. I want a life where I am allowed to exist fully, to matter, to someone who sees me. If that means standing at the edge of your world instead of at the edge of a ballroom, I think, she smiled, small but real. I think I can be brave enough for that. He stared at her, as if she had just offered him the first sunrise he had seen in centuries. Then, he said, and this time his hand found hers not as a shield, but as a choice, I will learn how to walk in the light a little more, and you will learn that you were never meant to vanish. Gently, in front of everyone, he bowed his head to her, not as a king to a subject, but as one soul to another, equal in worth. Around them, people who had ignored her all night watched in stunned silence, as the most feared protector of the valley treated the girl from the shadows with a reverence he had shown no one else. Later, there would be questions, rumors, stories twisted and retold. Some would say she had bewitched him. Others would whisper that he had saved her. The truth, quietly, softly, would be simpler and far more difficult to explain. They had saved each other from different kinds of loneliness. As the music slowly began again, tentative, hopeful, Liana glanced up at him. Will they ever stop staring? She asked, half laughing now. Eventually, he replied. And on the days when they don't, you may stand behind me, and I will take the weight of their eyes. On the days when I am too weary of their fear, I suspect. He smiled, the first fully unguarded smile she had seen from him. You will remind me that I am more than the stories they tell. She nodded. We can take turns then. Taking turns being brave, he agreed. He held out his hand, not as a king demanding, but as a man asking. Liana, he said, her name falling from his lips like a vow, may I have this dance, not to display you, just to honor the girl who refused to disappear. She looked at the floor where she had stood alone earlier, then at the circle of light now gathered around them. Her old fear whispered that she didn't belong in the center. Her new voice, quiet but growing stronger, whispered back, You belong wherever your heart stands tall. She placed her hand in his. As they stepped onto the floor together, the crowd parted, not out of fear now, but out of a strange, rising respect. The vampire king guided her gently, his movements careful, measured, as if he were afraid to break something precious. Liana moved with him, still unsure, still learning, but no longer shrinking. For the first time in her life, when she crossed the room, people turned and made way, not because she was in the way, but because they truly saw her. Overhead, the candles burned steadily. Outside, the valley lay quiet and safe. And in the center of the hall, a girl who had once believed she was invisible and a king who had once sworn to remain unseen began to write a different story together. One where being noticed was not a prize for the loudest, but a promise shared between two souls who had finally found the courage to look at each other and stay. She had been ignored all night. He made sure that, From this night on, she would never again overlook herself.